In this Studio 2 episode I will be covering mid-engined Group B prototypes, and once again that only includes the rally cars. There were plenty of planned Group B track cars that were mid-engined, but the history of that aborted circuit racing class will be best suited to another video. For front-engine cars I refer you to my previous video, link in the pinned comment. I'm starting off with a car that was never meant to be a Group B car at all, the FSO 2500 Racing, better known by its nickname, the Strato Polonaise. Now, FSO did have a Polonaise Group B car homologated, in the shape of the 2000 Rally, but it is not thought that the 2000 ever competed in a WRC event. It was used in many Eastern European events during its rally career, however. Before I start talking about the 2500 Racing, I must admit that there is not a great deal of concrete information about the history of the car. The most commonly accepted narrative is this. In 1977, the son of the Polish Prime Minister, Andrzej Jarosewicz, was rallying his personal Lancia Stratos in a national event when he crashed out. The car was practically destroyed, with photos showing severe body damage and possible chassis damage as well. It was clear that the car could not be repaired, at least not in communist Poland. So instead, he took it to the FSO R&D Centre in the hopes that they could use the parts for a new rally creation. The 2500 Racing was the result, a Frankenstein creation made from the body and parts of the chassis of the newly released Polonaise, the engine, drivetrain and centre chassis of the Stratos, and the cooling system from an FSC Star truck, mounted in the front to aid with weight distribution. In order to fit the much wider track of the Stratos, huge arch extensions were fitted, making the car look very homemade. It was truly a one-off creation, and that showed in its racing performance. To say that the Strato Polonaise was a handful to drive would be an understatement. Allegedly, the car was so directionally unstable that the driver, once again Jarosewicz, spun the car 3 times during its maiden event, only to go on to win anyway. The major handling issues were worked on over the car's career, but throughout it remained a very hard car to drive. 3 other drivers would compete with the car alongside Jarosewicz, and the car retired in 1985 after a surprisingly successful career for such a strange machine. After retirement, it would be sent to the Warsaw Museum of Technology and was restored in 2000 by students of the Warsaw Motor Technical College. Now, I must admit, this car shouldn't be in this video. It was never meant for Group B, nor was there ever a homologation version planned or built. It was a one-off built out of a crashed Lancia after all, rather than a factory model, even if it was built in FSO's R&D department. I included it in this video because it encapsulates the spirit of Group B rallying in my eyes, at least the early years of the class. Taking an otherwise mundane car and engineering it to the very edge of its potential performance through the use of highly expensive components, it's the formula for the 205 T16, Metro 6R4, Delta S4, BX4TC, and numerous others. Even though FSO had an actual Group B car, the Strato Polonaise will always be what I think of when the conversation turns to Eastern Bloc Group B. And that category is larger than you might expect, with the next 3 cars all being from east of the Iron Curtain. The most famous of these is the mad-looking Lada Samara EVA, which is often confused with its later Group S variant, the S Proto. While both cars share many similarities, I'll discuss the EVA first. It started out in 1984 as a private project by a group of engineers in an Estonian commercial vehicle factory, their aim being to make a fully fledged Group B racer. See, while Lada already had the successful 2105 VFTS, that competed in Class B10 due to its engine size. All the famous Group B cars, the O37, Quattro, 6R4, T16 etc., competed in B/12, so the Estonian engineers wanted a piece of that potentially lucrative pie. And engineer it they did, making such a good job of the prototype that government approval was granted, with Lada handing it off to the VFTS team in Lithuania to do the remainder of the development work. The car itself was named after the Samara, or Sputnik, Lada's bid to upgrade their rapidly aging range of cars in the 80s. But the name was one of the only things carried over, alongside the headlights, doors and windscreen. That was it. Everything else was either custom made, like the space frame chassis and low weight composite body shell, or heavily altered like the engine. The unit came from a 2106, but very little remained from that original 1.6 litre NatAsp engine. The engineers bored out the engine to 1860cc, fitted fuel injection and a turbocharger, among numerous other changes. The final output was 300 horsepower, not as much as the kings of the class, but almost double the 160 of the 2105 VFTS, and more than many of the smaller teams in B12, at least early on in Group B's life. But therein lies the problem with the EVA, that it began development in 1984. Group B's early life was over, and that meant that the reign of rear-wheel drive cars in the WRC was as well. Development continued for the next few years regardless, with some of the 200 homologation cars already built by Group B's cancellation. There was salvation in this, however, and it's a similar story to the Opel Kadett E4S I discussed in part 1. Both cars were somewhat underpowered for B12, but Group S's power limit meant that they could be competitive again. Although, the rear-wheel drive setup of the EVA, renamed as the S Proto in Group S form, would have limited that competitiveness quite severely. After Group S was also cancelled later that year, the team moved on to making a version of the Samara for Rally Raid, known as the T3. It is unknown just how much was carried over from the EVA project to the T3, as the Rally Raid car used a variant of the Porsche 959's running gear underneath that boxy body, more on the 959 later on. The EVA was the inspiration for this next car, possibly the most obscure car in either part of this double feature, the Moscovich Eleco 2141 KR. First of all, can I just say that I love the name KR when applied to performance cars. It sounds menacing and purposeful. It's a shame only the 2141 KR and Shelby GT500 KR have used it. There was also the Messerschmitt KR200, but that's not exactly a performance car, and that's putting it mildly. Anyway, back to the Moscovich. The standard Moscovich Eleco 2141 was a 5-door hatch that at first glance looked remarkably similar to the previously mentioned Polonaise. But it doesn't just take inspiration from that car, as the exterior is a near exact copy of the Simca 1307 range. If that name doesn't ring a bell, perhaps one of these will. But while the standard car was a Chrysler copy, the Group B version was anything but. Looking a bit like an RS200 or T16 that shrunk in the wash, the 2141 KR sounds very similar to its EVA inspiration at first. A tubular space frame chassis, composite bodywork, a mid-mounted engine, only the lights, windscreen and doors shared with the road car, clamshells front and back, it sounds like a straight copy. But the 2141 KR looks very different, and very striking, as well as being designed for a different purpose. This purpose was the B11 class, and to be competitive the road car's engine was bored out from its original 1.5 configuration up to 2 litres. It put out a respectable 175 horsepower, which was on par with most of its B11 competitors. The car not being four-wheel drive wasn't an issue either, as none of its B11 rivals were either. Once again, VFTS was involved, sourcing materials and parts from the project that would otherwise have been too costly to include. Development was going well, but it was well into 1986 by the start of testing. I'm sure you can guess the rest. A Group S variant was planned, then cancelled, then another variant was planned for a national A5 prototype class, which was again cancelled, this time due to a lack of government approval. The single remaining prototype now sits in a Russian car magazine's museum. The final Eastern Bloc prototype I'll discuss isn't actually mid-engined, but it is rear-engined, so I'd say that's close enough for this video. As you probably figured out from the previous video's ending teaser, it's a Skoda, but maybe not the Skoda you're expecting. The Group B Skoda that comes to mind is, of course, the extremely successful 130 LR, a B9 competitor based on the Estelle. But that car would take until 1985 to replace the Group 2 130 RS, a car that was not re-homologated for Group B in 1982. In the meantime, teams that use Skodas were getting impatient for a car they could actually use in Group B, and Czech company Metalex, MTX for short, decided that they could provide it. Like Skoda's previous rally car, the MTX Racer would be rear-engined and rear-wheel drive, being based on the Guard Coupe. In the UK, we know the Guard as the Rapid, with the Guard's facelift being sold with that name here. MTX developed the car in complete secrecy, with the first outside knowledge of the car being a display outside a government meeting in Prague in December 1983. The car was presented as a gift to the officials from MTX, perhaps to try and distract from its secret development. The plan did not work, and from that point onwards it would be viewed in a negative light by the party higher-ups, slowing development of the car. The Skoda MTX 160 RS, as it was known, did not actually use a Skoda engine, the MTX engineers instead opting for the proving unit from, of course, the Lada VFTS. God, VFTS does crop up rather a lot in Eastern European rally history, doesn't it? Anyway, this engine put out the same power as in the Group B spec VFTS, about 160 horsepower. More power was planned through the use of turbocharging, but due to the negative view of the car, permits for turbos were not granted. The gearbox was a Skoda unit from the 130 RS, but it was planned to be upgraded to a prototype Tatra 5-speed during later development stages. Various other changes over the original Guard were also implemented, such as a tubular subframe in the rear, 4-inch longer wheelbase, front suspension and all-round brakes from 130RS, and a custom MTX developed rear suspension setup. MTX would also test a steering system from one of their Formula single-seat race cars, but this was never confirmed as chosen for the final car. Various components were also made out of fiberglass, including the bonnet, boot lid and those huge flares, taking the weight down to around 850 kilos. Despite the Czech government's strained relationship with the car, it was agreed that it was a good enough quality to test both the MTX car and the official Skoda 130LR simultaneously, and the results are surprising. The 160RS ran stages far quicker than the works car on its first rally, before a crash reduced its lead from a high of 3 minutes down to 1.5 minutes come the finish. Further tests showed the MTX effort to be a very quick car, but two major financial issues would soon crop up. Firstly, the main sponsor of MTX's car, Agro Team, was shuttered in mid-1984, reducing the available funds for rally testing dramatically. Secondly, and this was far worse than the first issue, the many modifications the team had to make to the Guard necessitated 200 homologation cars. Skoda's own 130LR only needed 20 due to the evolution rule, and so this was favoured by the manufacturer, despite its weaker performance compared to the 160. MTX certainly didn't have the money to build the 200 cars themselves, so the project was cancelled. It is thought that 160RS platforms were used for development of Skoda's proposed four-wheel drive Group S car, based on the Favorit, but little is known about that project due to the swift cancellation of the class. Don't worry, this video isn't just about Eastern European rally cars, although that would be an interesting topic for another video. The West had their own fair share of mid-engine prototypes. Most were inspired by the success of the Renault 5 Turbo. Case in point, the Talbot Horizon Lotus and the Talbot Horizon Turbo. That's not a mistake, by the way. The Talbot Sunbeam Lotus and Talbot Horizon Lotus are two very different cars. You can probably tell that from the fact that the latter is in part 2 of this double feature. That's right, this is a mid-engine Talbot, with one of the prototypes sporting a livery just as mad as that idea. The story of the Horizon Lotus starts with its more famous cousin, the Sunbeam Lotus. The latter won the 1981 WRC title, however this was the final year of the Sunbeam's short production, and thus PSA realised that they needed a replacement. They didn't want to be campaigning a car that customers couldn't buy after all. Instead of attempting to slot the Sunbeam's front-engined, rear-wheel drive powertrain into a Horizon shell, as with the Opel Kadett D400 in the previous episode, PSA's engineers looked at the successful Renault 5 Turbo and decided to, well, copy it. For the first prototype, a Lotus Type 911 engine from the Sunbeam Group 4 car would be placed where the rear seats would have been, producing a decent 250 horsepower in rally trim. Still, PSA decided that this wasn't enough, and made a second prototype fitted with a turbocharged Type 910 engine. Variants of this engine, putting out around 300 horsepower when fitted to the Horizon, were made famous by their use in turbocharged Esprits up until 2004, so there was certainly no lacking in performance there, especially for the very early years of Group B. Despite the initial promise shown in testing, in late 1981 PSA would announce that the motorsport teams of Peugeot and Talbot would be merged into one, named Peugeot Talbot Sport. Also at this announcement, Peugeot's plans for a four-wheel drive Group B car would be revealed. This would eventually become the 205 T16, possibly the most successful Group B car of all. In order for development on the T16 to start, the Horizon Lotus and Horizon Turbo, as the two prototypes were nicknamed, would have to be cancelled. It was a sad end to a promising start, especially after the underdog story of their 1981 championship win. But it meant that the T16 was built instead, so I suppose it was worth it. Talbot's rally efforts after this point amounted to a Class B9 competitor, the Samba Rally, but that was it, the company being shut down in 1986 due to low sales and profitability. Another stab at making a mid-engined Renault 5 Turbo-inspired Group B car was this, the Alfa Romeo Alphasid Sprint 6C. A long name for sure, but there'll be a longer one later on. The 6C was, to put it simply, an Alphasid Sprint fitted with a 2.5 litre V6 from a GT-V6. Of course, this was mounted where the rear seats would have been, making this a two-seater. While it's unknown how much power was sent from the engine through the car's ZF transaxle, it's safe to assume that it would be broadly similar to the GT-V6 touring car's unit. This would mean around 220 horsepower. Not a great deal, but decent enough to have been properly quick in the right hands during the first years of Group B. A more powerful Evolution variant was planned for later on. This is thought to have produced around 280 horsepower from a 3-litre version of the same engine. Two prototypes were built and shown, however for a long time it was thought that the second prototype was built and modified from the first. This was dispelled when the original prototype was later found, in a back area of the Alfa Romeo Museum. The earlier version is often referred to as the road version, and the later one as the race version. However, when they were revealed, Alfa talked about both cars as just the 6C, not differentiating the two. Despite a low weight of less than a tonne and a promising spec sheet, Alfa's money troubles during the 1980s meant that the project was cancelled, the 200 homologation cars required being regarded as too expensive for the company. Upon me mentioning the 6C, a select few of you will likely be thinking of another car broadly similar to the Alfa, the Quattro Group B. This was a short-lived but very quick Australian development of the car, using a 330 horsepower HSV V8 and a ZF transaxle. Sadly, only 15 cars were built due to the extreme cost of the drivetrain and having to import fully built Sprints for conversion. It's often lumped into conversation about the 6C, but I believe that it was never meant for rallying, instead being one of two things. Either it was built for the Group B circuit racing class, or it was simply named after Group B, in the same way many appliances in the 80s had turbo in their name, simply to drum up hype in buyers. I'm leaning towards the latter, as I don't think the company could have built the 200 necessary cars for homologation, certainly not within the time stipulated in the rules. Do you remember when I said there will be an even longer name in this video? Well, here is the car that I was talking about, the Daihatsu Di Tommaso Charade 926 Rally. Like FSO with the aforementioned 2000 Rally, there was already a lesser Charade competing in Group B. This was the 926 Turbo in Class B9, homologated in 1985. The 926R, as it is usually referred to as, was to be a 926 Turbo with the engine moved from the front, where it powered the front wheels, to the middle, where it will power the rear ones. It was a sign that even in the lower classes of Group B, the mid-engined philosophy still reigned supreme. That engine would be broadly similar to the one in the Turbo, a turbocharged 96cc 3-cylinder, but while in the Turbo it put out about 80 to 90 horsepower, in the 96R that would be increased to 120. The car would still compete in Class B9, despite its mid-engine layout, and it was hoped that it could be very successful there. The road car prototype shown at the 1985 Tokyo Motor Show weighed just 800 kilos, so Daihatsu was confident that, in rally trim, the weight could be reduced closer to the 675 kilo minimum weight requirement for the class. The suspension setup was completely changed from the 96 Turbo, the 96R featuring double wishbones all round. The track was widened to allow for wider tyres, 205s on the front, 225s at the rear, making the little Charade look very squat and purposeful. Everything was looking good for the team, and despite Group B's 1986 ban, there was hope that Daihatsu would have the funds to make 5,000 road cars for a Group A variant. This never happened, of course, and it's thought that Daihatsu felt that the investment wasn't worth it now that Group B had ended. After all, during that era, rallying had almost matched F1 in terms of popularity, and after its cancellation, general interest in the sport had started to wane. By the way, if you're wondering why this little Japanese hatchback is wearing the name of an Italian sports car make, it's complicated. It started in 1976, when Di Tommaso bought Innocenti from the newly defunct British Leyland. Innocenti were building a rebodied version of the Mini, but rather confusingly this was also called the Mini. It was later renamed to the Small, a rather cute name in my opinion, but that's irrelevant to this video. In 1982, Innocenti would switch from using the A-series in their Minis to various Daihatsu units, which would remain until the model's end in 1993. This collaboration would lead to Di Tommaso badged performance charades as part of the deal, even after Di Tommaso sold Innocenti to Fiat in 1990, and the 926R was just one of them. I'm sure you've heard of the Michelotto Ferrari 308s that competed in Group 4 and Group B, doing well on tarmac stages but poorly off-road. Well, there was an extensive development of the car that started development in 1981. This was called the 308 GTM. Changes over the 308 GTB rally car included the following: changing the engine layout from transverse to longitudinal to aid with servicing, using a tubular space frame chassis for rigidity, a more aerodynamic body made from carbon fibre and Kevlar, and a more powerful engine rated at around 360 horsepower. Although the majority of the GTM's development came after the 037 won the last WRC title for rear-wheel drive cars, Michelotto and Ferrari were confident that using the layout would be advantageous due to their extensive knowledge and experience with the system. The very high power-to-weight ratio was also in their favour. However, squabbles between the two companies meant that by the time the first car was completed, it was 1984. While the car was quick, the signs were beginning to show that even Ferrari wouldn't be able to compete with four-wheel drive, at least off-road. The project was thus cancelled, but weirdly that isn't the end of the story. Two Ferrari race drivers would contact the company over the next few years, requesting to purchase their own 308 GTMs. The first, built for Zorn Blaton, would be occasionally seen in rallies during the Group B era, but the second never competed in any, instead being used for track days and circuit work. The latter car brings me to a point I'd like to make, about a common mistake that people like to bring up when talking about Group B cars that never made it. The famous 288 GTO is often described as Ferrari's Group B rally car, but this is simply not the case. While the 288 GTO was homologated for Group B, it was for the unsuccessful circuit racing category, not the rally class. Despite this, the car was still expected to be used by some teams as a replacement for their 308 GTBs in tarmac rallies, which could be where the confusion arose from. But back to the point, stop saying that the 288 GTO was a rally car. It wasn't. Another iconic supercar widely associated with Group B is the Porsche 959, the concept preceding the car even being called the Group B. Originally designed to replace the rear-wheel drive 911 SC rally car, the four-wheel drive 959 started development in 1983. There was a lot of crossover between the rally model and the circuit racing model, leading to confusion between the two. This was because Porsche only greenlit the rally car if it would benefit their road and circuit racing operations in a major way, and that road car variant would end up being the main focus of development. Porsche's desire to make the 959 road car the best they possibly could meant that there were endless delays to the rally car program. These delays, combined with rising costs, led to the end result being incredibly expensive to buy and run, turning away potential privateer customers. This lack of demand made Porsche hesitant to spend even more money developing the rally version, especially as by this point the class looked to be on its way out, Audi having already pulled out due to safety concerns. The WRC project was not officially cancelled, but development work would instead shift towards Rally Raid, specifically the Paris-Dakar. After some initial reliability hiccups, the 959 would prove to be a force to be reckoned with in the Dakar, winning the 1984 and 1986 rallies with that famous Rothman sponsor. Even if development hadn't stopped on the Group B rally car, the first production 959s were built in 1987, and were thus too late for homologation into the class anyway. I've mentioned often in this double feature how the Audi Quattro, and the four-wheel drive system of the same name, led to many rally cars of the era being uncompetitive, but even the Quattro itself was starting to lose steam come the mid-80s. Predicting the rise of mid-engine and four-wheel drive cars in Group B, Audi's engineers began an unofficial project in 1984 to allow the car to remain competitive. The official upgrade to aid the Quattro's competitiveness was the Sport Quattro, but the engineers knew that this wouldn't be enough. Their plan was to use the S1 Sport Quattro's underpinnings, but with a mid-mounted engine instead of the front-engine configuration of the standard car. This had to be kept secret from higher-ups at Audi and VW, as admitting that the Quattro was no longer competitive would be a huge blow to marketing. In order to maintain maximum secrecy, the testing and initial development of the car was done at the Desnov test facility in communist Czechoslovakia. By paying off locals and the police force in the region, Audi could confidently test in complete secrecy, with photos of the development work there not surfacing until 2004. The car was almost identical to the S1 Sport Quattro, save for the engine placement, which meant around 450 horsepower, although the S1 E2 would say that up to 600 horsepower was possible in rally trim. Reactions from test drivers were very positive, with low-speed handling, a Quattro weakness, especially improved. The beginning of the end for the Quattro Mittelmotor was with a planned test run involving Audi's works rally drivers. This was to take place in Austria, near Salzburg, but the media had been alerted of the proposed test and were thus swarming the venue. In order to maintain the secret nature of the car, Audi quickly decided to instead test the car just over the border, in Germany. The general view from the works drivers was incredibly positive, the car being easier to handle at both high and low speeds. However, the changed location of the test run was not quite as secret as Audi had thought. A photographer from an Austrian car magazine somehow knew about the revised location, and managed to take at least one photo of the car, which subsequently appeared in said magazine. This shattered the secrecy around the project, leading to VW cancelling all operations within just 2 days, due to Audi not seeking permission from the parent company before investing funds into the project. Their mid-engined Group S car was also cancelled, and all Mittelmotor Quattros and Group S prototypes were dismantled, except for a single example of the latter. That particular car wasn't on VW's books as being built, and was thus spared, but sadly that is all that remains of either project. The Quattro is one of, if not the most iconic Group B rally car, but another famous one is the Ford RS200, developed after the RS1700T's cancellation. See Part 1 for more info on the latter. The RS200 itself only competed in one season, and was closer to the road car than almost any other works entry, leading to disappointing results. This was planned to be fixed with the RS200 Evolution for the 1987 season, which incorporated a more powerful engine setup of around 550 horsepower, along with significant weight savings throughout the car. The planned 1987 introduction meant that the RS200 Evo was too late to compete, although one did find its way into the European Rallycross Championship, where it competed until 1992, winning the 1991 title. In Rallycross trim, the car could produce up to a staggering 900 horsepower, but this was only used for the final race of a weekend. Another RS200 Evo was built in 2004 for an attempt at the Pikes Peak hill climb, although this was built using spare parts by a third party other than Ford, Mach 2 Racing. Stig Blomqvist drove that particular car, achieving the fastest time for that year. These two cars showed that the RS200 Evo was a promising development of the original, although of course we never got to see the car on an actual stage against its Delta S4 and 205 T16 rivals. It's quite sad really. All of these prototypes are. They all represent teams of engineers working to the absolute best of their abilities during one of the most innovative eras of any motorsport. But looking at it another way, perhaps it is a good thing that they never competed. After all, Group B was cancelled on safety grounds, so introducing even more cars to the sport may have just resulted in more tragic deaths. So, just like the end of the class itself, the end of this double feature is bittersweet. Until next time, this has been Studio 2.